Good morning and welcome to this Brexit webinar. I'm Sarah Dawadi, and with my colleague Alex Veach, who's FTA's head of global policy, we will take you through the latest developments on Brexit. The last few weeks have been very busy, and one of the main events was the publication of the UK government's white paper. We will devote most of today's webinar to the white paper. And after a short update on the current status of negotiations, we will take you through the content of the white paper on border checks, on transport, and Alex will present the customs arrangements. Last but not least, I will also give you some indications about the reaction of the EU 27 to this white paper, which is one of the big tests for the next steps and for how the white paper will be taken forward. But first, as usual, a few house rules. Please keep your microphone muted so that other participants can't hear any ambient noise or noises that may occur around you. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on the FTA website probably in the course of next week. Unfortunately, during the webinar, we won't be able to deal with any technical issues. But if such issues happen, do not hesitate to go back to us after the end of the webinar to ask questions, and of course, to go to the website to listen to the recording, which will be available in any case. If you have a question during the webinar, you can use the chat box to send it through, and at the end, if we have enough time, we will answer all those questions. And if some questions remain unanswered, we will deal with them afterwards. You can contact us by email, and questions will be collected and uploaded on the website as well. So a few words to start on the current status regarding the overall negotiations, and specifically on the withdrawal agreement, which is the instrument needed to secure a transition period. The content of the withdrawal agreement is to a large extent agreed, but the Irish border has been the biggest stumbling block so far, and it is still not solved. You may remember that the June EU Council was once expected to be an important milestone on the road to finalizing the withdrawal agreement. However, as it had become obvious in the days before the Council in June, it didn't really bring any breakthrough. Member states issued a statement highlighting the lack of progress on the Irish border issue, and they also asked the UK to clarify its negotiating objectives for the future relationship. So this is the purpose of the UK government's white paper that was published last week. It describes the UK's vision for the future relationship, and it's intended to be a negotiation basis. So it was published on the 12th, and the first opportunity for official comments from the EU 27 will be the General Affairs Council tomorrow, in which member states will discuss not only the white paper, but also the future relationship in broader terms. The vision outlined in the white paper relies on a common rule book for goods. The white paper recognizes the complexity and the integration of supply chains, and the objective is to avoid border checks. This common rule book, which is proposed in the document, means the UK would apply the same rules as the EU, for example, on product safety or environmental rules, which would normally remove the need for conformity checks on goods, and it will also remove the need for other checks at the border. The government's position is that products should only need to undergo one set of requirements, one set of tests, to access both the UK market and the EU market. Of course, more details will be needed to put more flesh on the bones based on the principles set out in the white paper. But this objective to remove the border checks, thanks to common rules, is something we welcome. In addition to what is proposed for manufactured goods, the government is also proposing a common rule book for agri-food products. It would cover all rules that are currently checked at the border. That can be sanitary and phytosanitary checks. And those rules that are related to the protection of human health, animal health, and plant health. These rules are currently checked at the border for trade from outside the EU. And they would potentially be very disruptive, as they would affect 100% of all consignments, at least for document checks, and they could take more than 15 minutes per batch, only for document checks, bearing in mind that a lorry or a container can contain, of course, many batches. In addition to document checks of these sanitary and phytosanitary rules, a percentage of animal-based products and plant-based products would also undergo physical checks. So this is how it currently works for imports from the rest of the world. But the common rule book, which is proposed, could remove the need for such checks, which would be, of course, a welcome relief. The UK government does not intend to include wider food policy rules in this rule book, such as rules on labeling, because government considers that this would not be necessary to avoid the checks at the border. And instead, regarding these labeling rules, the UK would seek equivalence arrangements similar to those the EU has with other trading partners. The white paper also proposes mechanisms to deal with future divergence between EU rules and UK rules, be it for goods or for agri-food products, because divergence could occur as the EU revises its body of rules, and you may know that revisions are quite frequent, given the number of different legislative texts and rules that are concerned. As per the vision set out in the white paper, a joint committee with representatives of the EU and representatives of the UK would examine all changes to those rules that are part of the common rule book, and they will try to agree on whether it is necessary to incorporate the changes in the rule book. Alternatively, the joint committee could also recognize alternative UK rules as equivalent. And in the absence of a consensus on this, or if the UK Parliament decides not to amend UK law accordingly, which would remain a possibility, that would have consequences on trade, and part of the agreement could be suspended. That's what the white paper foresees. And in such a scenario, sanitary and phytosanitary checks, for example, on agri-food products could be required again, which means that border inspection points should be available just in case, even if the initial intention is to get rid of these checks. So we have highlighted this point. We had a first discussion on the white paper with various government bodies, and this is one of the aspects we highlighted, because we're not talking about small investments. Border inspection points have to be dimensioned to cope with a given volume of goods, and given the mechanism which is foreseen to deal with potential divergence, there is unfortunately some uncertainty regarding how many batches would be concerned, and when the need for checks could kick in, given we're talking about future changes. So that's what the white paper contains regarding goods and agri-food products. in terms of removing the need for border checks. There is also a section on transport, and I will now give you a bit more information on that. On transport, the most detailed and comprehensive part is the one on aviation. The UK will explore options for reciprocal liberalised access to the aviation market through an air transport agreement. And this would allow UK and EU carriers to operate services to, from, and within the EU and UK territories. According to the white paper, the UK will also seek participation in the European Aviation Safety Agency. However, there is no mention of replicating air transport agreements signed with third countries, which is one of our asks in FTA's Keep Britain trading agenda. So something which is unfortunately not covered in the white paper. On rail transport, the white paper suggests that rail connectivity should be dealt with through bilateral agreements with France, with Belgium, and with the Netherlands to ensure continuity of rail services through the Channel Tunnel. But there is nothing on qualifications of train drivers and not much on technical standards either. But the white paper highlights that the UK is willing to keep its own policy for domestic rail transport. For road transport, I must say that this part is disappointingly short. There is a strong commitment to avoid any permit system for lorries operating between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which is very good. But the language used in the document does not clearly rule out the prospect of permits for other flows apart from the island of Ireland. There is a mention of the road haulage bill, on which we reported in previous webinars, and which is a permit-based contingency. So there is a mention of that, but there is no mention of the UK's preferred option, which is liberalised access based on mutual recognition of the operator license, without the need for any permits and without volume restrictions, without quotas. This is the preferred option, as it was presented by the Department for Transport several times prior to the publication, but it's not in the white paper, which is not a great signal in terms of the priority which is given to this topic. However, we were reassured in the past few days that the government's position in favor of unrestricted passage of trucks still stand. There is no mention of the UK's position on recognition of qualifications and nothing on driver licenses either. But we know that the UK government's position remains the one that had been outlined in the slides that were presented to the task force of Michel Barnier, namely mutual recognition of CPC. And it is also worth noting that the UK has just decided to recognize EU 27 driver CPCs and transport managers CPCs. So you see that even though the white paper is not necessarily comprehensive, it can be too short and it lacks details on some aspects related to transport, does not mean that previous positions have been changed. And even if the transport part is short of the expectations we had based on previous expectations, based on previous interactions in terms of the level of detail, we were reassured that there is no position shift away from the line that the FT had previously taken and which is consistent with FTA's asks to keep Britain trading. So that was for transport. I will now hand over to Alex for a focus on the customs part of the white paper.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everybody. So I'm going to attempt to give you a kind of plain English translation, really, of this proposal for the facilitated customs arrangement. I'm going to try and do this in 10 minutes with 4 slides. So this will not be the whole story. There are many things that our members are asking questions about, and ourselves and other stakeholders are finding out more about. But with that said, let's dive in. So look, this first slide is bringing out from the white paper itself the key elements of this facilitated customs arrangement, or FCA proposal. It's worth remembering throughout this that this is very much a proposal. This is not a definite outcome unless agreed with the EU. So essentially, as if we were in a combined customs territory with the EU, the UK would apply the EU's tariff and trade policy for goods intended for the EU, and then apply its own tariffs and trade policy for goods intended for consumption in the UK. So this means that the UK essentially ensures that goods entering through the UK border but bound for the EU will comply with all the EU customs processes, and the correct EU duties are paid. And the really important bit is highlighted in bold here, that this removes the need for customs processes between the UK and the EU, including the customs declarations, checks on rules of origin, and what it says here, entry and exit summary declarations, otherwise known as security and safety declarations. And so, you know, a lot of what government has heard from our association and many others is our huge concerns over delays and problems at the busiest UK-EU trading routes. And so, you know, what's really attractive to us about this idea is this part here in bold about removing the need for customs processes between the UK and the EU. And as the final bullet says, you know, this would preserve frictionless trade for the majority of UK goods, you know, because we trade, our biggest trading partner in goods is the EU. So, you know, it's a really, really interesting idea. We're keen to explore the detail, and let's get into that a bit more now. So if you could do the next slide, Sarah, please. Thank you, Sarah. So I've got a couple of slides now where I'm going to do my best to explain how this might work. This is completely taken from the white paper. I've just tried to put it into a sort of more visual guide. So let's just take it step by step here. Let's say that there's we're talking here about the UK border. So there's a product destined for the UK, which comes in through the UK border. Now, this word destined is again a white paper word, but what they really mean here is the place where this good will be finally consumed, the place of final consumption. That will be the UK. So in those cases, the product, the importer of that product would pay the UK tariff. Okay. Next one, we're at the UK border, but the product is destined for the EU. So the EU tariff would have to be paid. Now, for the two first examples, the way that the scheme would work is that an importer would become a quote-unquote trusted trader and be able to robustly demonstrate where the goods are destined for. So they would have to show HMRC that the goods are going to be finally consumed in either the UK or the EU. And the status of being trusted would then let this company pay the customs duty as it crosses the EU border. So they would actually be expected to pay the correct duty rate, whether the UK rate or the EU rate. So the third box here is where that doesn't happen. You know, the company maybe isn't a trusted trader, or you know, the system breaks down, they can't rate where the goods are going. So what they do then is they pay the higher tariff, whichever it is, the EU will pay. And then if they are able to, if they can pull the paperwork together and show that they can go where the goods were finally consumed, they can apply for a repayment. But the white paper is confident that the vast majority of transactions will be done by trusted traders where the correct duty is paid up front. Okay, next slide, please, Sarah. Now, I wanted to put a slide on the remittance or the reciprocal arrangements for repaid duties here, mainly because this was the big issue that came up in Parliament on Monday night, if you're following the politics of this. So let's try to explain the way that this would work. So let's say that, let's take it the other way this time. So duty is paid at the EU border, but the good is destined for the UK. So just for the sake of argument, let's imagine a large British importer that whose goods arrive first point of entry to the EU at the port of Rotterdam, and then the goods are transshipped to Britain. Okay, so the duty would need to be paid at the EU border, so at the Dutch border, Rotterdam port in this case. Okay, so now, let's say that there is a difference in the duty rate between the UK and the EU. So there would now be an agreed tariff revenue to remit to each other any tariff revenue. So I've just tried to explain the way that it would work for the UK border. Now, for the EU border, it's going to be a little bit different if this proposal is agreed. So this is a direct quote from the White Paper. The UK is not proposing that the EU applies the UK tariffs and trade policy at its border. So there would not be the need for this rather complicated trusted trader scheme that I tried to outline in the previous slide. Instead, as I've tried to put in English on the right side here, all goods imported to the EU but destined for the UK would simply pay the EU tariff. And this is why this amendment, Priti Patel and Morgan and others on Monday night, was accepted by the government, because there is already a plan to have a reciprocal arrangement where, if there are duties owed to each other, there would be a formula and an agreement to pay to each customs authority the revenues due. I mean, I think all that amendment from Monday night did was say that the UK would not be able to unilaterally collect EU duties on behalf of the EU. There would need to be some reciprocity there. But I mean, it's a government policy issue about whether that was ever on the table. And I think, judging by the fact that the government accepted the amendment, that appears to not be the case. So this reciprocal arrangement for duty was in the plan, all along, and that's why that amendment was accepted, as I understand it. Okay, should we go on then? Next slide, please. And coming towards the end of this part now, I wanted to stress that there are some elements of the kind of other model, this maximum facilitation or max fac model that remain, and we were pleased to see this, because there are some of these facilitations that are just really important to retain in this whole process. So there are proposals around procedures for VAT and excise, make that as straightforward as possible. I don't have any detail on that, to be honest. And similarly, cooperation and exchange to make it easier for traders, small parcels, and then individuals for personal use, make that sort of function as well as possible. One thing we were delighted to see here is the accession to the Common Transit Code. Quickly plug a report we did about 18 months ago, 10 ways to make borders work after Brexit. We talked about the CTC here, some other measures which are just absolutely critical to fully functioning customs border. Pleased to see that there, and also the recognition of authorised economic operators. That's really important. You have to have a robust AEO scheme as well. And then three last bullet points are actually things that you might call unilateral measures. They're not really Brexit dependent. These are things that really actors on the trade side, stakeholders, including ourselves and others, have been calling for some time. So greater use of self-assessment, customs duty, aggregation of declarations, speeding up the process to get businesses authorised to use these kind of technical customs measures can really make a big difference to their business. And simple things like clarifying what the guidance is, making it easier to get access and understand the benefit of some of these requirements across Egypt, which are already existent under the UCP, and which really help, particularly high volume traders, rest of the world trade already really help reduce paperwork and burden on those businesses. So back to you there, Sarah.
Thank you, Alex. As you rightly highlighted a bit earlier, the white paper is really a basis. It's a proposal from the UK side, but nothing, none of the points we represented are agreed on, and we're still very much expecting the official reaction from the EU 27. So far, the reactions, which were informal, were very measured. Michel Barnier's task force welcomed the publication, but there was no strong reaction on the content. Michel Barnier made it clear that they would assess the white paper against the guidelines and principles the EU 27 have been focusing on so far. So he didn't say much more than that, but from this statement, we can anticipate that some aspects are likely to be met with, let's say, skepticism. You know that the EU 27 has been insisting on no cherry picking, on the fact that the four freedoms and the single market are indivisible. So it will be interesting to see what the reaction to the common rulebook is, given that this rulebook covers goods only. So that's going to be one interesting test. You may also recall that the guidelines insisted on having strong governance mechanisms and dispute resolution mechanisms for the future relationship. So this is something which is covered by the white paper. There is a proposal to have an arbitration board with representatives of both sides, of the EU 27 and of the UK. And this arbitration board, in the event of a dispute, would try to solve the dispute, possibly based on the interpretation of EU rules given by the European Court of Justice, even though, as we understand it, as we understand the white paper, the interpretation of the European Court of Justice would not be binding, because the objective is to have this joint arbitration board as the only entity that could decide on dispute resolution. There is quite a complex system which is detailed in the document. I've just summarized what it is, but it is very likely it is going to be one of the points on which there will be discussions. The FCA, the Facilitated Customs Arrangements, is also likely to raise many questions. As Alex explained, it's quite a refined system. So there will be more discussion on how it could work. That will be necessary. But in terms of reaction, the European Parliament's Brexit Steering Group suggested in a statement published after the Chequers Agreement that outsourcing some of the EU's customs powers to the UK could be problematic. So the fact that the UK could levy duties on behalf of the EU at the border is not something the European Parliament, at least, is very supportive of. That being said, we have no clear indication from Michel Barnier's task force which leads the negotiation on behalf of member states. We have no clear comments from them on the FCA itself. But as the FCA is quite similar to one of the previous options, max FAC, that was presented before, it's not unlikely that the question marks that the EU27 had regarding the max FAC will remain and will still be on the table and will remain to be discussed regarding the FCA. So many points to further discuss and study, but the trickiest point is probably the Irish backstop. The EU27 want a solution to prevent a border on the island of Ireland under any circumstances. And for the EU27, the transition period is conditional on such a backstop. This is top priority for the EU at the moment. And if you look at the white paper, it focuses on the future relationship, and the Irish border issue is expected to be solved through the overall relationship. This is not exactly how the EU27 see things, because the EU wants to find an all-weather solution to avoid a hard border prior to any detailed discussions on the future relationship. If you just have a look at the agenda of this week's round of negotiation, you see that there is one point, there was one point on Monday on the future relationship and the white paper, but most of the negotiating time this week is devoted to the Irish backstop and to finalizing the withdrawal agreement. So in terms of how the EU wants to face the discussion, you see that the backstop is really key, and the content of the white paper, which is the future relationship, is not something the EU is really willing to focus on immediately, at least not as long as there is no progress on the Irish backstop, which has been really the biggest stumbling block so far. So again, the white paper is a negotiation basis. Our assessment at FTA is that it is a welcome negotiation basis, even though clarifications are needed. In terms of how acceptable it can be for the EU27, there are still several potentially problematic points, not least on the timing and the phasing, as I've just explained. So at this point, the prospect of no deal and no transition period in March next year is still on the table. So we'll have to see how much progress can be achieved in the next few months. In terms of the next steps, there could be an informal summit in September, but discussions on the withdrawal agreement and on a brief political declaration outlining the future relationship are unlikely to be finalized in time for the October Council. That being said, an extraordinary meeting of the Council could also be called for later in the autumn, but this outcome of even this extraordinary meeting would very much depend on the willingness to move away from red lines on one side or the other, because based on the EU27 guidelines published earlier this year, based on the white paper and the UK government's red lines, there are still points on which no agreement seems to be possible if no one moves away from the red lines. So that's where we are. That's what we can tell you for the time being on the white paper. We're going to follow very closely the discussions this week. and monitor the reactions from the EU27. We already had several meetings in which, again, the EU27 said they would analyze in depth what the UK has put on the table, and we will continue updating you as more information becomes available. Which brings me to the forthcoming events and various activities. If you're interested in more Brexit updates, please do register interest in our weekly digest. Just to give you an idea of what you can find in this digest, in Monday's edition this week, we included a detailed analysis of the white paper in a table assessing the proposals against FTA's Keep Britain trading agenda. So do not hesitate to contact us for more information on this. There are aspects that we decided not to cover in the webinar because the white paper was over 100 pages, so we had to make choices, but the analysis is available, so please do get in touch. Next week, Alex will run a series of conference calls and a meeting of FTA's customs group. If you're interested, please contact Alex using the email address you see on the slide. This is going to be for FTA members only, but do not hesitate to ask for more information. The next webinar will take place on the 20th of September. We won't have one in August, but you can already register for the September edition by clicking on the link on the slide. And I also want to mention the International Road Transport Operators Conferences we are organizing. They will take place in October in various locations. All three conferences will have a very similar, if not identical content, but you can pick the location which is most convenient for you. Brexit will be one of the topics we will address. There will be quite a substantial session on Brexit with external speakers, but there will be also other topics addressed, such as the revision of road haulage rules. It's primarily for road transport operators. We're going to focus specifically on the needs of operators that are operating in Europe. But it's going to be also a good opportunity to have interaction with officials on Brexit, be it on permits, road haulage permits, or on various other arrangements on driver licenses, for example, and a number of other aspects. Thank you for your attention. You can always visit our website to find more information on Brexit, and Alex and myself remain at your disposal if you have any questions on what was discussed in the webinar and possibly on aspects we did not cover today. I don't see any questions in the chat box, but again, we will watch our emails, and if you want more information, we'll be able to provide more. Thank you for your attention, and have a very nice day.